Welcome to the game. I'm Mark Simon.
And I'm Bob Marks.
It is the staple of newsrooms all over America that somebody has to write a year-end review story, usually assigned by an editor who doesn't have to write the story, but has probably written more than a few in their lifetime. So we're going to have some local editors on to talk about the year-end review, make them do the work they usually make the reporters do. We're happy to welcome our friend Jon Mays, editor-in-chief of the San Mateo Daily Journal, and also our friend Angela Swartz of the Almanac. Will be joined, we hope, soon by Peter Tokofsky from the Coastside News Group. Both of you, thank you for being here. It's great to see you. Jon, let's just plunge right in. What are the 3 or 4 big stories from 2024 that you think really characterized the year?
Well, I mean, of course, everyone's kind of fixated on the sheriff's office and the troubles there. So that's kind of an obvious one. Another one is the domestic violence murders that have happened throughout the year. It kind of was kicked off with a sentencing for Jose Landeta for the murder of Karina Castro that happened last year in San Carlos, in which she was basically decapitated with a sword on the street. And the sentencing was in January. And then we've had, I think, up to 5 separate cases of domestic violence murder in San Mateo County this year, including a double murder. It was a murder-suicide and then a killing of 2 small children in San Mateo. So that's pretty problematic and troubling overall. They're not connected in any way. It's just sort of one of those things. And so there's been a lot of effort behind the scenes to sort of provide resources for people and to build awareness about that issue. So it doesn't reach that point. The other one that sort of reaches or stands out to me is the La Quinta issue in Millbrae and the trouble with Millbrae officials in the county over converting the former, or actually still working hotel, converting the hotel into transitional housing for seniors and for families, created quite a controversy in that city and sort of galvanized a large crowd of people that actually turned out to recall 2 of its council members and have them replaced with like-minded people. And so kind of changed the entire makeup of the council and how the city is governed moving forward. And just the use of recalls, we've seen that in the region with Chesa Boudin and then Price over in Alameda County and the Oakland mayor. So it seems to be sort of trending as well to have recalls being used more prominently for people who are disappointed. And then I would say also retail theft and Prop 36 and sort of how to deal with that from the police and law enforcement standpoint. And then one more is the development slowdown. It's kind of one of those interesting stories. It's that the story is that things aren't happening. So development, all the development that we had been writing about just sort of stopped and was put on hold. And that has an implication for city budgets, and that has larger implications for city services. And that's really what affects people. So those are the sort of big stories that, in my mind, for this year. And obviously, those will continue into this next year, too, as well.
Well, we'll come back to your list and go over it a little bit more. But Angela, what are the first few topics that come to your mind?
Yeah, the sheriff's office as well, because we cover the county as a whole. We've also been covering spending in the Las Lomitas elementary school district. So they have schools in Midland Park and Atherton. And their teachers and librarians went on strike earlier this year, and they kept mentioning that there was some fiscal mismanagement happening in the district office. So one of our freelancers, actually, he was an intern and is kind of like one of those super interns who sticks around as a freelancer. But he started looking into it because the teachers have been saying that the district was spending money on like luxury stays and expensive restaurants and whatnot. And so he ended up reviewing over 600 credit card transactions that were made at the district. And he did find that they were spending money at like Michelin star restaurants, staying at Four Seasons in San Francisco. And so obviously people in the community are pretty upset, and the teachers were bringing this up because they were saying, well, why can't we get raises if they're spending money on all these things that public officials should not be spending money on. So yeah, I think in Mountain View there's a similar situation, which our sister publication has been covering, where they hired like some sort of like energy healer or something who's making six figures, and so the state is doing an external audit there, but it doesn't. The school board is doing like a third party audit, they say, but it's unclear if the state is going to look into it. There was a community meeting last night, and I think there might be some news out of that, but our reporter is working to confirm what's going on there. But the superintendent, Beth Polito, she announced that she was retiring amidst all of this. There have been calls for her to resign.
There's nothing quite like a well-timed resignation and retirement.
Yeah.
The entire, all the incumbents on that school district board were reelected, weren't they, in the midst of all of this?
Were they reelected? I think so. We didn't cover that race super closely.
It's just such
But
a,
generally in our area, there aren't elections for school boards. They just are, appointed after no one else runs. But yeah, it's been interesting to follow that. So in our area as well, in South San Mateo County, there are still a couple of towns that haven't had their housing elements approved. So like Portola Valley and Woodside. Portola Valley actually had it approved by the state, and then it was rescinded by the state. So they're still in the process of having their housing plans approved by the state, which basically means that if there's a builder's remedy project, which means that people can come in and build outside of what's normally allowed in housing plans, those are okay. And also there's been threats from the state that there's going to be charges, like monetary retribution for not having housing elements that are passed, but they're still behind, and it's unclear what's going to happen to them. Yeah, because Menlo Park did have theirs approved, and they still do have builders remedy projects because there were some things before the housing element were passed, when they were out of compliance, that are still on the books. So I think there's one project that's like would be like up to, I want to say like 400 feet tall. Basically this tower in Menlo Park that's under consideration still. So a lot of folks down here are really concerned about like potential development that could happen. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those were most of the major stories.
Okay.
Jon, let me ask you, the La Quinta issue, do you think in part it's a byproduct of people that have lived in the community for many years, kind of versus people who are newer, may have more progressive ideas? Do you think that's something that's going on in Millbrae and perhaps in other communities you cover?
I don't think that's the case in Millbrae, because the coalition that was against La Quinta ran the gamut from long-term residents, I think, right, is the name.
Like Mark.
And newcomers. So it wasn't newcomers versus it wasn't like a NIMBY issue. I mean, I guess it was in a way, but it was, it's people bought homes in Millbrae because it fit their needs and they liked it. And I think what happened here was that the county was moving forward in a pretty aggressive way with these hotel conversions using Project Home Key money, and then Room Key became Home Key. So Room Key during COVID was to allow for homeless people to have a place to stay, so they wouldn't, so they could get stabilized and they wouldn't spread COVID. And then that became Home Key, and that was a pretty successful project overall, with a number of different locations in Redwood City, Half Moon Bay, San Mateo. None of them were 100% perfect. There was some issues in all of them. You're dealing with transitional folks, and sometimes there's some issues amongst them, right? So any of those issues were brought up by people in Millbrae. What happened is that there was some boiling sort of dismay and concern on the part of some Millbrae officials about not getting grants, not getting the attention that they deserve and feel and need from not just the county, but from regional other regional entities like BART, SFO. They just kind of felt stepped on a little bit, and this was a chance for them to sort of stand their ground and say, no more. And so when they had these community meetings in which the county chief executive officer, Mike Callaghy, spoke to 500 people, it wasn't a matter of him sort of answering questions. It was him just getting yelled at. And certain elected officials in Millbrae didn't help that situation any at all. In fact, inflamed it further and created this situation in which there was a point of no return. So, from my perspective, I was disappointed to see some of that behavior, because I think all, situations can be rectified through conversation, dialogue, and that type of thing. And that wasn't of interest to some people there. And so here you are the project's not moving forward. They don't have the money for it because of this, right? And so you lose that opportunity. And that's just how it is. That's just what happens. But in the meantime, you had 2 council members who didn't want to sign on a letter saying that they disagreed with this. And then they were recalled, basically. So Millbrae sort of gets, they always say you get the leaders you deserve. And so that's sort of what happened. I mean, I'm not saying that the new leadership in Millbrae is poor, but these are the leaders that the overwhelming crowd of people who are extremely vocal in Millbrae right now want and deserve. And so, it seems like the issue sort of settled, and here we are, right? So that was just a very interesting situation for us to follow, and all the ins and outs and how all that went. Like I said, it's settled, but we'll see what happens with when they start talking about other things in Millbrae rather than this particular issue.
We're going to be joined now also by Peter Tokofsky, who is, executive editor-in-chief of Coastside News Group, which includes the Half Moon Bay Review and the Pacifica Tribune. Peter, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
We were just asking each of our other guests, give us the top 2 or 3 stories from your area that you think will be memorable beyond 2024 or characterize the year. Real quickly, what are the 2 or 3 stories from your area?
Well, certainly we have to talk about Pilar, the humpback whale, who took up residence in Pilar Point Harbor for 9 days, and I think was a good gauge of people's psychological disposition, whether there was empathy or joy or fear associated with that. So we can talk about Pilar. I'm sure my colleagues have mentioned housing. Housing is, of course, a big issue throughout the Bay Area. On the coast, it's particularly connected to questions of farm worker housing, affordable housing, as well as the booming industry of school district workforce housing, which is at different stages in the different school districts up and down the coast. On the coast, we're also experiencing some challenges with healthcare facilities that are accessible without our having to come over the hill, as we like to say. And big changes in our local governance on the city councils in Pacifica, Half Moon Bay. The Cabrillo Unified School District just swore in 2 new members last night who really want to take some different directions for the district. Both of those districts are among the lowest funded in San Mateo County, so that's an ongoing challenge, but they've also just both passed new parcel tax and bond measures, so that's a developing story as well. So those, and then of course, Half Moon Bay is, law enforcement in Half Moon Bay is from the sheriff's office, so we're very much invested in that story as well.
Let's talk about that a little more. As you would expect, both Angela and Jon mentioned the sheriff's office too, and you can make a case that that is the story of the year, although clearly it's going to be a story well into 2025. What does it say about the county? There are a lot of people who are saying that it's uncharacteristic of San Mateo County, that this is not the kind of controversy we have. We either have controversies that are much smaller or much or more low key. And Angela, let's start with you. Is there anything that you can draw about what San Mateo County is like now because this kind of controversy is taking place? Is there an underlying message from this whole thing, or is it just an isolated episode that's just blown up into something very big.
Yeah, I don't know, because the previous two sheriffs also had issues too. So it seems to be a reoccurring theme in the county. So I'm not, yeah, it's hard to say why it's blown up to this proportion, though. I guess it has sort of like the scandal element as well because of the relationship between Allende and Corpus. But I don't know. Maybe Peter and John have some ideas about why they think it's
John, what are your thoughts, John?
Yeah, I mean, we've had controversies over the years, and certainly, in a variety of different departments. I mean, San Mateo County, you're right, does have a reputation for being relatively quiet compared to, I mean, it's like comparing, like, you're the good kid because you didn't get arrested, but you still, went out and blew past your curfew, right? So, like, there's other, there's San Francisco, there's San Jose, there's Oakland, there's big cities around us. So, of course, we're going to be a little bit quieter than those cities that have a lot more attention, a lot more action, a lot more things going on, right? But we've had our share. I mean, we had problems with the probation department. Angela referenced a couple issues with the two previous sheriffs as well. There's been issues with members of the board of supervisors and even in the DA's office. And I could count up all the different stories and everything. But yeah, you're right. This one is a big one. It's a whopper. It's huge. And I think what sort of I mean, Angela mentioned, because of the relationship between Victor and Christina, the sheriff, as being sort of what grabs people nationwide. But for us, it's just, if you read the report done by a trusted judge, Ladores Cordell, you see a lot of worrying material. And, it's like Barack Obama said, this would be real interesting if you weren't in the middle of it. I mean, this actually has real life impact on our readers and the people in this community. The instability in the sheriff's office is of concern, serious concern. And so I think that's why, for us at least, why, it's a extremely serious matter that there's basically 100% no confidence among deputy sheriffs, the sheriff sergeants, the captains, the board of supervisors, all the state and federal elected leadership, all basically are asking, and we did too, ask for her to resign because the agency itself is in disarray, and the sheriff has exhibited poor leadership in getting it to this point. Whether or not there was some concerns or issues within the department that she was trying to rectify doesn't really matter at this point, because there's no confidence in the leadership, and you can't run an agency that way. And so that's why it's a concern, and that's why it's going to be ongoing until there's some sort of resolution. And the only resolution that I can see that would create any form of stability in that office is if she were to leave. And that's why we said in the editorial that she should resign at this point. I don't see that happening, and so we'll go through the process to see how she can be removed from office. But it is a serious concern to people in this county, and we take it very seriously. And it's not something, the salacious parts are salacious, and that's fine. But there's also very serious concerns about law enforcement and how the morale of that department affects the people in this community.
Peter,
let me interject here, Bob.
Sure.
Peter, from the Coastside, the sheriff's office is the main law enforcement agency. How is this impacting the Coastside?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, I think that as a resident and for our readers, I would say we're incredibly grateful for the rank and file and that they continue to do their job and do their job well. So what could be a very frightening situation of disarray in the law enforcement is so far not playing out in our public safety. So that's number one. A big chunk of the Cordell report, I do some teaching, and everyone likes to cite the number of pages, but good papers can be shorter too, and that's a big chunk of those 400 some odd pages are transcriptions of interviews, and including also a whole debacle with the Coastside Bureau captain who felt that she was being mistreated by the sheriff, takes up a lot of space, and she ended up leaving the agency. And that's one of the kinds of problems that that are emerging from this. But her replacement seems to be doing a good job. We are not feeling any risk on the coast. But indeed, when I tell out of town friends about this, and I'm still a relative newcomer to San Mateo County, I've been here for 5 years, but this has got the makings of a great novel or thriller, whatever it's going to be. But there's so much going on here, and Jon may be right that resignation is the only possible outcome. But the reports that there's a buyout offer being made. I mean, we're trying to outdo John Oliver late night comedy here with this kind of thing. And we do have democratic processes. If laws were broken, as certainly is suggested in the Cordell report, there are legal remedies. And of course, it's now set for special election in March. So, and of course, recall exists. Democracy is not always quick and painless, and there are processes that are going to have to play out here.
Let me ask you, Angela, and others may want to chime in on this. Is there any way that you can gauge the level of interest with this story in your communities? With an election on the horizon, certainly likely to be a very low turnout election, have you picked up a certain level of buzz in your communities about this issue?
Can I just can I answer this real quick? I'll just give an example. I went to the dentist and I was getting my teeth cleaned, and the dentist asked me about it. And as I was sort of describing the situation, everybody in the office came into the room to listen. And so even another patient came in, and a couple of the hygienists. So just as an example, people are very much interested in this.
Angela, have you been getting your teeth cleaned lately?
No, but we definitely are seeing way more comments on our social media posts related to this, and a lot more viewership on these posts. So yeah, there's definitely people interested and a lot of people emailing us too.
Yeah.
So.
Peter?
Yeah, we're able to, as I'm sure the others are too, count the clicks on different articles and our sheriff stories. And we're a small staff. We haven't covered every single breaking news release on this, but we're getting a lot of clicks.
Okay. Well, thank you for doing your year-end review with us. We appreciate it. Bob and I are going to stick around and talk a little bit about some other issues, and probably gossip about you behind your back. But I want to say on behalf of everybody who lives in this county, we have, in an era where people are worried about the decline and fall of local news, we have a remarkably vibrant local news community. And all three of you represent really significant and important work that's being done here. So I want to wrap up 2024, at least with you three, by saying thank you for what you do. It's hugely important, and so much of it is at the heart of this whole question of the sheriff's office, is holding elected officials accountable, making sure that they know they're being watched. So Jon, Angela, Peter, thank you for being with us, and thank you for what you do, and good luck in 2025.
All right.
Thank you.
Bob. Thanks, Bob.
Same for all of you.
Bob, before we move on to any larger issues, I wrote a column talking about the likely demographic turnout in a March 4, 2025 election. It's likely to be older voters like you, more conservative voters like you. That I don't think that bodes well for the sheriff. I mean, it's tricky because it's a charter amendment that would then give the Board of Supervisors the authority to hold a hearing. And even people I know who are not happy with the sheriff and think she should go are uncomfortable with this idea that it's going to be done through extraordinary authority given to the Board of Supervisors. But all that being said, what's your sense of the March 4 ballot measure and how you think that might turn out?
Well, it's hard to say at this point. We're either going to have an election where not a lot of money is spent, a lot of discussion, continued coverage of it, in which case I think that does benefit the the board and those that want to oust the sheriff. I don't know whether the sheriff is going to mount a vigorous campaign. I'm interested that there seems to be an effort in recent days to kind of undermine the Cordell report. Obviously focusing on a few pieces in the report. The thing that struck me, and when we talked to Supervisors Mueller and Corzo, is it's the totality of the report. You can pick away at different things and you can say, well, that's not that big a deal. But when you look at the totality of the situation, the sheriff says, well, this is just Carlos Bolanos and his buddies trying to undermine my efforts to bring the sheriff's office into kind of a new era. But the reality is a lot of the upper level people that have either left or been fired were people that she brought in, not people necessarily loyal to the past sheriff.
Well, and that's an important thing. You know, if I had to sum up the whole thing, I've been giving this a lot of thought, which is a measure of my own obsessive behavior. You know, she took office, she'd been in the office 20 years, but she never had more than about 10 people reporting under her. Now she's running a department with about 800 people. She never supervised the jail, corrections. She never had a supervisory role in the detective bureau. She had worked in various parts, and she's very good at community outreach. She's a very likable person on a number of levels. But she had these significant gaps in her track record of how does she manage a department this big, considering she hasn't run major parts of it. So she did something very smart, which good leaders will do, which is recognize her own gaps. And she brought in two very well-credentialed, very credible people from other police departments. One named the undersheriff, Chris Shung, the other named assistant sheriff for operations. Both of them very qualified for that job. But then she also hired Victor Anye, whose only credential in law enforcement is that he'd been a volunteer reserve deputy and he hadn't even compiled enough hours to necessarily qualify. Most of his career had been as a real estate agent. And that looks to be the fatal flaw, because if you read the Cordell report, he's the reason all these people left. And so I keep trying to say to people, it's about the sheriff and her reliance on him. The other thing that's interesting is in an atmosphere in which you're being accused credibly of intimidation and retaliation, to arrest the head of the Deputy Sheriff's Association in the midst of this, boy, I mean, your experience in politics, I could just imagine if she were your client and you heard about this, you'd be out of your mind. It's like, what are you doing? And then, of course, this week, the district attorney announced that no criminal behavior had taken place, that there was no basis on which to charge or arrest the guy. So it's going to be interesting. And as a side note, I went back and looked at her campaign finance reports, the one she filed in the middle of the year, which she's only required to do because she's not up this year. She has an $18,000 debt. It's her own money. She loaned her campaign money, but she starts off with a debt. She doesn't start off with a substantial amount of money. The other thing I found that was interesting, I mentioned the president of the Deputy Sheriff's Association, Carlos Tapia. He was a donor to hers of $250 in 2022. So I think one of the problems she's going to have, there were a number, well over a dozen sheriff sergeants and deputy sheriffs who gave money to her campaign. I can't imagine they're all lined up to do it again. So it'll be interesting to see. She's very, very adept at getting free media. But at some point or another, that wears off unless she continues to move the ball forward. And I think what right now she's doing is reacting to whatever the other guys do. That's a tough position to be in, a reactive position.
Yep. Certainly evidence of that with the Carlos Tapia situation was the timing of the arrest. Happened, almost simultaneously with the release of the Cordell report.
Yeah.
So it strikes me that she and Mr. NJ are good at the kind of back and forth politics, immediately reacting to one thing that's done or another. The question is, can they mount a credible defense of their activities? And, the voters, how are they going to react to it? So it's going to be very interesting.
We also need, I think, to see the Cordell report for what it was, which was, it wasn't a forensic analysis of criminal behavior. It was simply a personnel investigation, nothing more. And the yes side has to understand that needs to be the starting point. It can't be their whole case. They have to have more. And the news about the arrest of Carlos Tapia helps, because it's hard to conclude. You mentioned the timing. It's hard to conclude it is anything other than retaliation and an attempt to upstage the issuance of the Cordell report.
Yeah, and I think there is still interest, certainly on the part of Supervisor Corzo. My understanding is also incoming Supervisor Spear of trying to convince the sheriff in some manner to step down, to save the county further embarrassment and save the money. I mean, we're talking about close to $4 million to wage this election, and the focus of everybody has been on this issue, where you start a new year and you'd like to, focus on things that people really need and care about.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting. Obviously this story is not going away. There's also a recall effort sort of underway. It's really still getting organized, although Jerry Hill has agreed to be the lead person. They filed the campaign organizational papers earlier this week. And he's listed as the principal participant. So we'll see how that comes together. There are people who want to see her gone, who think that it ought to be a vote of the public, since it was a vote of the public to put her in. I cannot imagine at this point, given how well they have dug in their feet, that she resigns. And I have to tell you, I actually don't believe there was a $1 million offer made to her. I think there was maybe some very preliminary discussions. And I would be surprised if there was even a dollar amount in those discussions, which makes me suspect that was leaked by Corpus and her folks to Dan Noyes at ABC7, who has become apparently their principal conduit. And speaking of that, even as recently as last weekend, I was in a text conversation with Victor Agne about having him and the sheriff on. We have asked them to come on a number of times, and he says yes. And then when it's time to set a date, it doesn't happen. So I don't want to say they've declined. I'm hopeful that we can still have them on. But every time we try to nail that down, the conversation seems to fizzle out. There are other things going on in the world.
Yes.
Clearly, if you're looking at 2024, there's really only one story that dominates everywhere, every time, isn't there? Yeah,
there's no question that we've got a new president that's coming into the White House here. Some would say he's already there. He's not physically there. And it's, right now, I think we're seeing a very different approach by President-elect Trump than was during his first term. He says that before people were out to get him, and now they're very receptive to him. But when you follow his career, he has these periods where things are going well, and then something happens, usually by his own making, that kind of sets everything abuzz and everything turns into chaos. So I think we need to wait and see how this plays out.
Well, he doesn't like to go very long without his name being the one that's on everybody's lips. And it's interesting, 8 years ago, I'll confess, I'm sure a lot of people did the same. I'd get up every morning and look at my, the news, and what did he do today? And I just don't feel quite as compelled to do that. Whatever he's going to do, he's going to do. And, you know, there's a point at which outrage just isn't sustainable.
Yeah.
And it'll be interesting to see what Congress does, because some of them, even the ones who are supportive of him, must have some sense that they need to assert congressional authority as well. You know, that it is a tripartite form of government, and that Congress can't just be a rubber stamp. And one of the challenges that the Republicans have is that they don't have a big enough margin in the House in particular to get everything done the way they want it done. I mean, Trump talks about zeroing out this or zeroing out that, like the Justice Department or the National Institutes for Health. But the House has to agree to do that. He can't do it by fiat. And I think that was always one of his big frustrations in his first term. You know, business executives, you know, as well as I do, we've had any number of business executives who have run for the Senate in California, and they all seem to think it's going to be like being a CEO. So they hold a meeting, they say, okay, we're going to do this. And at no time do they expect someone like Nancy Pelosi to stand up in the meeting and say, yeah, we're not doing that. And I think that was troubling for him. I don't know if he's learned anything new about how he's supposed to be doing this.
Well, I think his plan is basically to change that equation, to change the way government operates. There clearly has been growing frustration over the last decades with the way government operates, and really all institutions that are out there. I think people are totally frustrated. But you gotta think that at some point, maybe early on and maybe often, he's going to trip up against, I think, that authoritarian tag, and that he's likely to go too far at some point, and we'll see how the people react to it. People, I think we're fairly clear in this election that they want something done about the border. They want prices to go down. That probably is not going to happen the way that people would like to see it. And so, you know, we'll see how skillful he is at playing it out this time, and whether people will see a real difference in him.
Well, it'll be interesting because, you know, I think in his first term, he clearly was not concerning himself with what other people thought.
Right.
I do think, you know, I've always wondered, for example, when you loosen regulations on dumping in rivers and in lakes, why would you want that to be your legacy, that you manage to pollute more? And I understand there's an economic component to it. There's a business component to it. And so he thinks his legacy is going to be that he built a robust economy. And if you have to foul a few rivers and lakes, it's okay. But I think he's going to be more conscious of how he's going to be perceived when he's done with this. And that may temper some of his behavior. At least I hope. Maybe I'm being overly optimistic. And by the way, we shouldn't neglect, you predicted all along on this show that you thought he would win. And I was absolutely certain that was not going to be the case. So credit to you. For
Whoopee.
Yeah.
It you know, and it does kind of, the other side of the equation is you got to look at the Democratic Party. And, you know, all along, they fed in to a narrative to help build him up. Even the early days of the Republican primary, where it wasn't certain that he was going to be the nominee. I think the Democrats created a situation where he was able to raise more money, create more momentum every time he was indicted. And I think, like you said at the beginning, you can only carry anger so far. And hopefully they'll learn to deal with him differently. Rather than try to delegitimize him, take him head on the issues that are important to them. And hopefully they'll find somebody that can articulate those issues to people so they can regain some of the people that they've lost in the last 8 years or 10 years.
That's an interesting point. You know, during the George W. Bush administration, I had a conversation with Nancy Pelosi, and it was just before the Democrats took control of the House and she became Speaker. And she said that most of her work with her caucus was telling them not to say anything. Let them do all their work, all our work for us. And there may be a lot to be said for just let him go, because we all know he's going to overreach. The Republicans will overreach. There's a temptation among conservative Republicans to think everybody agrees with him, and it's just this complicated conspiracy of the deep state and the Democrats and the news media that prevent them from succeeding. Well, they're not right about that. And the evidence of that is we went from Obama to Trump to Biden to Trump. This is an electorate that is looking for something that isn't present right now in the current situation. But the smartest thing they may do is just simply let Trump and his people do their work for them. The other thing, you mentioned the Democrats, there should be reason for encouragement. First of all, they're actually pretty good at reappraising themselves when they lose, unlike the Republicans who didn't do that after Trump lost. But also what was evident from the Kamala Harris search for a vice presidential running mate, they have a good bench. There are a lot of Democrats out there, younger generation, fresh faces, and interesting and exciting people. And if there had been a primary fight, this would have been a whole different dynamic that would have taken place. So you can anticipate whoever the Republicans want to put up in 28, that there'll be some really interesting Democrats to choose from.
Yeah, and dare we talk a little bit about 2028 and the Democrats? Seems like you've got a half dozen top tier Democratic candidates running. And I've been interested, as I'm sure you are, to follow our governor and what he's been doing. The thing that struck me about Trump in 2015, when he first got into the race, is he was able to carve out about 15% of the Republican voters to support him early on. And while the other candidates were trying to appeal to everybody, he was able to build on that continuously throughout. So the question is Governor Newsom trying to carve out a portion of the Democratic electorate and try to jump out to a lead? The other candidates tend to be a little bit more moderate, at least the main candidates. And so is Newsom trying to kind of connect with the progressive part of the party and then somehow try to turn back to the center as the process goes on if he's able to get the nomination? It's going to be fascinating to watch him.
Well, the one thing we've learned, at least locally, in local politics, the progressives are the most active.
Yeah,
they're the hardest charging activists and advocates. So I would imagine that will remain the case at the national level as well. And follow the money. I mean, the question is, will he find financial support for what he's doing to keep it sustainable? Because he's leaving office in 2 years.
Yeah.
Any other issues, any other stories you think, or is that pretty much the story of 2024?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it is the story of 2024. There's an issue I keep coming back to in this county. We've talked about it a lot. We had two essentially Democratic socialist candidates, one in South San Francisco, one in Redwood City. And Espinosa Garnica in Redwood City lost, but very narrowly, her bid for re-election. But in South City, James Coleman won overwhelmingly. And I'm wondering what's the difference between those two candidates? Why did one do very well and the other not so well? What's your take on that?
Well, first of all, it's important to remember that every election isn't a yes or no. It's compared to what?
Right.
And in the case of Coleman, he was facing an opponent, somebody who had been recruited by Carol Matsumoto, one of the legendary political figures, not just in South San Francisco, but countywide. But he wasn't a very good candidate. He just wasn't. He was brand new to politics. There was a funny moment where James Coleman put out a piece saying he was the only Democrat in the race, and his opponent, Alvin Sharma, who's a very nice man, was outraged until he discovered that he was actually not a registered Democrat. He didn't even know. And so that story kind of went by the board. And there you go. I mean, that's, to me, sums it up. He just wasn't, you don't just show up I mean, James is the exception because he just showed up and was very good at it from the beginning. James is a very astute politician. He's very smart and he understands politics. And, he also understands there's a difference between being an activist and being an elected official, and that you have to broaden your appeal. Even if your views don't change, you have to find ways to win people over to what you're trying to do. And then there's a bread and butter sort of stuff that politics has to do about making sure the streets get repaired and the street lights stay on. And James was very good at that, I believe. I went to an event where they dedicated a park right next to the Caltrain station to Carol Matsumoto. And in the midst of a campaign where she had recruited somebody to run against him, he emceed the event and was very gracious and very thoughtful and really did a nice job. And that's important to me, that understand the politics has to be broader, especially once you're in office. Espinosa Garnica just didn't really opt for that. And famously said in an interview with me, described herself as a socialist, and ran a very good campaign. The person running against her, people say, didn't run as good a campaign, but was good enough. So that's part of it. In fact, you saw a number of times where there was sort of a retrenchment that the 2020 and 2022, all during the pandemic, all during the Black Lives Matter movement, progressives made significant gains, and a lot of those were sort of drew back this next time around, because in many ways this is not a progressive county. It's a pragmatic county, and so you saw in the race for supervisor between Lisa Gaucher and Antonio Lopez, they're both basically have the same view on most of the issues, but she's much more pragmatic and much more practical. And so most of her campaign, she talked about, getting to 3 votes. You need to get things done. It's not enough to be an advocate for something. And so the candidates who tended to be willing to be the one in a 4-to-1 vote consistently had a tougher year.
Yeah. Before we close, I want to circle back to our earlier discussion with the 3 editors. And that is that I've lost my train of thought. So maybe it's
they talked about housing. They talked about.
No, I remember now. When I was involved in Peninsula TV, Comcast did a survey on the peninsula. And one of the things they discovered that the people who were most interested in our station were people that were new to the county, people that perhaps English was a second language, that there's a hunger for local news. And it really struck me at the time. And I think there's no question that hunger remains. And I've noticed an uptick in friends of mine in terms of local news. So we talked about the importance of those newspapers, and it certainly is a difficult environment for the newspaper business. But boy, we need to be able to find ways to satisfy that hunger that's out there for people to know what's going on in their communities.
Well, that's a great point, and I think it's reinforced by social media that we're beginning to understand that it's not really connecting us. Yeah. That it's not a connection. It is it's entertainment more than it's information. Yeah. And so maybe that's because people really feel the need to be connected to the community. Especially if you buy a house around here, it's not an exaggeration to say you are invested in this community. Yeah. I mean, buying a house has always been the single largest investment that most people make anyway. But now, I mean, the level of investment you have to make, I would imagine that's going to, and it's going to bring more people to a desire to feel connected to the community. And most of our cities really do things that, a generation ago, we wouldn't have seen the kinds of things that happen in our downtowns all the time now. Dia de las Muertas, you see that every year in more than one downtown. And Redwood City has one every year. It's huge, but more than one city has music downtown. They all have downtown festivals. And when we were growing up around here, Bob, back before the earth cooled, that sort of stuff didn't happen. Maybe, San Bruno had the Posey Parade, but it really wasn't. The downtowns are much more a centerpiece to the social life of people here. So that's fascinating too, to see. Maybe that's one of the reasons why, we have a very vigorous local news situation, and it's unusual in our in the community. And it also speaks to the education level of our folks. Our producer, our friend Frank Bravo, did send us a note saying that we have overlooked the biggest story of the year, which dovetails with what we're just saying, and that's the return of the game.
Yes.
Frank, would you come on? Would you come on the screen and put your face on for a second? Yeah,
sure,
there's our producer, Frank Bravo. I got to tell you guys, it's been fun. I was a little reluctant to do this. I thought, I've already chewed that food. Why am I doing this again? Bob and I can confirm we never were sure anybody was watching our TV show, except maybe the people we had on, and only if they were there to see how their hair looked. But I've been stunned and pleased at the number of views some of these shows get. Now, our interview with Corzo and Mueller did very well, and that's partly because some of the other folks, like the Deputy Sheriff's Association, sent it out through their own network. But this has been fun. It's enjoyable, and it gets back to what you were saying before, Bob, that it turns out it's probably important to be doing this. Yeah. And Frank, I want to make that's the reason I wanted you here. Frank's the only reason we are able to do this. Bob and I have no idea.
No, that's not entirely true.
How we're doing it. We just show up and Frank does everything. And so thank you, Frank. 2024 has been a good year. It's been nice to reunite with Bob. And it's been fun. And 2025 just promises to be even more of the same.
Yep. I think we really, there are big changes going on in this county. And I think the longer that we do this, the more we can really focus in on what's happening and what people are thinking. So I look forward to next year. And I echo your comments about Frank. You and I, over the years, have gone to lunch hundreds of times, and we have similar discussions but Frank is the reason that it goes beyond us and the people at the table next to us.
Unfortunately, Frank started off with a beard that was fully brown.
Yeah, exactly.
And hair. So thank you for letting me be a part of this. I mean, I know that Mark, you and I have talked about doing something like this for a lot of years, and we in previous lives we had done these kind of things. And as my passion is local journalism, local media. I've been in it for my entire life, and thank you, Mark, for letting me getting me into that. And I won't go into the details of that, but it has been, and that's the reason I am still in local media, is because this is important. And the three people we had on earlier, it is important for them to have a voice beyond their printed product as well, and be able to have a show like The Game where people can come on and talk about the local news is extremely important. And like you said, we've seen the number of views go up. We've seen the number of YouTube subscribers go up. And hopefully 2025 is a place where we can actually push that further and get even more exposure into our communities.
Well, let me know how that works out, Frank, because clearly you have an idea of how to do that, and I don't. In fulfillment of Frank's continuing mission, I should tell you, you can find us on YouTube, any of the places you find podcasts, and we have our own link there, thegamepeninsula.com. We're happy to have you here watching us. And and please believe you are part of the conversation. This is fun to do, but it's also, I think, important to do. And with that note, I guess we'll wrap up 2024. I'm Mark Simon.
I'm Bob Marks.
Frank, your turn.
Oh, hey, I'm Frank Bravo.
Thank you for being with us, and join us next time on The Game.